Hello again guys, welcome back to the channel. In today's video we are going to be taking a look at Microsoft Flight Simulator's Sim Update 5. More specifically, we're going to compare the most recent version of the sim with the previous iteration. We'll be running a couple of scenarios side by side between the two versions of the sim to get a feel for what improvements, if any, there are. Obviously these findings will be based around my own personal computer. You can find the details for that down in the video description below. Anyway guys, as always I do hope you enjoyed the video and find it to be of use. If you do, please consider giving it a like and subscribing to the channel. Let's get this mini review underway and we'll head for our first scenario. So our first scenario, as you can see, we're currently in the Cessna 152. We're on the ground at Sierra Alpha Yankee Bravo or Base Belgrano 2 airport. And the conditions of our flight, as you can see, are almost identical. The only differences between the two clips, as you can see, the aircraft on the left has the engine shut down and the aircraft on the right has the engine running, but otherwise they're in exactly the same state. And as you can see, the time of day does slightly differ between the two clips, but that's purely down to a little quirk that I had when setting up the flight. As you can see, we have sky clear and absolutely zero auto-gen around. And so really, to my estimations, this flight configuration represents the absolute best case scenario within the sim. It should more or less give us about as high a frame rate as we can achieve on this system. So starting with the most obvious and arguably most important change, as you can see there has been a significant improvement in frame rates with the newest update. Worth mentioning that I usually run the sim on the high preset at 1080p with AI traffic turned off. Those are really my only alterations. With the most recent update we've gone from around 55 FPS on the left up to about 70 on the right there. And I believe the number below the FPS is actually the time taken in milliseconds to draw a frame. As you can see, that's come down from around 18 milliseconds to about 15. All in all, that equates to about a 25% increase in FPS. So rather on the lower end of what was potentially being touted before the update came out, but still a very reasonable increase nonetheless. And I did actually choose this scenario for a specific reason, as obviously the Cessna 152 is pretty simplistic in terms of its systems and any rendering in the cockpit. So actually the techniques that Asobo have used to improve the sim's performance should have less of an impact here than they will in the later scenarios. Anyway, on the main thread parameter, you can see that we've gone from around 16 milliseconds there down to about 12.7, so again, a nice little improvement. In terms of the RDR thread parameter, this is a little bit of a guess on my part, but I presume that stands for rendering thread. Interesting to note that on the right-hand example, the time has actually gone up. Again, it's my understanding that now some of the rendering has been pushed to another core, so I'm not quite sure why the time would increase there. And the last of the main parameters we're going to look at is the coherent draw. Another interesting parameter there, as that's one that often tends to affect my system. I believe coherent draw relates to the rendering of the aircraft displays, so particularly when flying aircraft with a lot of avionics systems, for example the fly-by-wire A320, the coherent draw seems to hammer my frame rates pretty hard. Again, in this particular scenario we wouldn't expect that to be taxing the sim too much, but as you can see the coherent draw times come down from around 0.5 to 0.9 on the left to around 0.1 to 0.5 on the right. Again, a very nice and substantial increase that will hopefully help when flying the more complex jets. We'll be taking a look at that in just a moment's time. Lastly, we'll just touch on the sim's memory usage, both in terms of our RAM and our GPU memory. And again, as you can see, some really substantial improvements there. In terms of our system memory usage or RAM usage, we've gone from about 7.3 gigabytes of RAM down to about 3.4 gigabytes, so we've more or less halved our RAM usage there. Certainly that's going to be of significant benefit to people running systems with less RAM. And in terms of our GPU memory, again a slight reduction there. We've gone from about 2 gigabytes down to around 1.3. So as you can see, in terms of the raw data, the improvements certainly are there. And again, this is based around a scenario where we're not expecting to see major improvements versus something like a high fidelity jet. I think the main takeaway here is that 25% increase in FPS and that halving of the memory usage. Anyway, we'll now move on to a more complex scenario just to tax the system a little bit more and demonstrate some of the areas where Sim Update 5 should really help with the frame rate. So for the next scenario, we'll be heading to the cockpit of the 747-8 to carry out the New York landing challenge. So here we are now in the cockpit of the 747, and once again I've tried to keep these scenarios as similar as possible. As I mentioned during the previous test, this sort of scenario should really highlight the improvements that Asobo have made much more significantly than with the Cessna 152. Obviously we do have a lot of glass real estate here in the cockpit, and it's my understanding that this rendering has now been moved onto another core of your typical multi-core processor to allow the main thread to really focus on rendering the sim itself. You only really need to look at the colours on the left versus the right to see that the previous iteration of the sim was not a very pretty picture compared to Sim Update 5. So we'll just briefly run through the parameters again. Obviously there has been some pretty significant improvements. On the FPS, nearly doubling our FPS there. That's certainly much more in line with what we've heard about Sim Update 5. 43 FPS is still nothing to write home about, but it's certainly much more manageable and flyable. One of the areas that we've really seen a significant improvement in is the main thread times. And again, this is an area where Sim Update 5 is supposed to help. And in terms of our coherent draw, once again a big improvement. We've gone from 0.7 on the left to about 0.3 on the right, so we've pretty much halved our coherent draw times. And again, if my understanding is correct, that's what we'd expect to see. We've now moved the rendering of all these glass screens over to another thread on our CPU. So we would expect that coherent draw time to come down, as well as an increase in FPS. Again, in terms of memory usage, we've seen some pretty significant improvements there. We've gone from about 12.3 gigabytes of RAM used down to about 5. And GPU memory usage, we've gone from about 4.9 gigabytes down to just below 3. As you can see, whilst we do have the higher frame rate, the sim still isn't silky smooth, though there is certainly a significant and noticeable improvement. And we'll just touch on the last part of that for this mini analysis. The next section of the analysis will be much more qualitative in nature, but we'll briefly fly the Extra 300 around the City of London, just to see how much smoother or not the sim is overall. So as I say, this last test is much more qualitative. We really just want to get a feel for how smooth the sim actually is with the increased frame rate. I chose London and the Extra 300 as obviously we do have some glass screens in the cockpit, and London of course is a fairly intensive area to fly around in the sim. Overall, I have to say, and as you can see for yourselves, I was a little bit disappointed to see that the increase in frame rate doesn't necessarily give a major increase in terms of fluidity within the sim. I would say that whilst the major stutters are perhaps less regular, you certainly still see them, at least on my system. Particularly it seems when making rapid changes in direction. It would certainly be unfair to say that there's been no improvements in terms of smoothness. Certainly I have noticed less stuttering, but personally I was rather hoping that the update might do away with the significant stutters altogether. Of course this is very system specific, and again my system is nothing special, but personally I feel, and I'm sure that many of you will agree, it's actually fluidity that's important as opposed to raw FPS, in terms of generating a positive flight simulation experience and overall more immersion. So it seems that there is still some work to be done in terms of dragging Microsoft Flight Simulator into the 21st century in terms of how it runs. One nice little feature, as you can see, we can now fly under bridges, although I have to say there are a fairly long list of things that I would rather Asobo had fixed first. And I haven't had a chance to look into it myself yet, but as you can see there's quite a few issues there with the screens of the aircraft. So really hoping that once again we haven't seen a fix in one area, only to then go and find that something else has been broken. So there you go guys, I hope you enjoyed our little breakdown and analysis of Sim Update 5 and the various improvements that it brings. I have to say that outside of performance there are some other really nice improvements that have made their way into the sim. On my end, loading times certainly seem to have come down both when loading the sim itself and certainly when loading scenarios. We have a new world map which is significantly improved over the older version. We have float and ski aircraft, as well as a couple of new scenic flights. Some of the old issues do still persist though. We still have screen tearing with the frame rate unlocked, again at least on my system, which is a real shame as I find that the sim actually runs more smoothly without VSync. And whilst it's very hard to quantify, I think it is worth mentioning. It might just be my imagination, but I do feel like there has been a degradation in terms of ground scenery. Certainly the autogen to me looked a little bit more blurry than it did previously, so I wouldn't be surprised if once again Asobo aren't playing the trick of downgrading the graphics to save on the performance. And whilst it is nice to see an improvement in FPS, I have to say I'm pretty sure I was seeing about the same FPS a few months ago before Sim Update 4. So I would say if anything, Sim Update 5 is actually giving us back the performance that we had previously in the sim, as opposed to being a huge step forward. All this being said, I don't want to be too negative. It is nice to see that increase in FPS once again. The sim is seemingly a little bit smoother as well. So hopefully that's going to help me with my videos going forward, and I've also been holding off on live streaming waiting for the update. The plan is within the next week or so we'll get some sort of live stream going on the channel, so keep your eyes out for that. And also planning to do a video within the next day or so on the recently released Orbis MD-10. That aircraft isn't flyable, but we'll do a little guided tour, and any of the proceeds from that video I'll give to Orbis themselves, so again keep an eye out for that and please watch if you can. Anyway guys, once again I do hope that you enjoyed the video. If you did, please consider giving it a like and subscribing to the channel. If you have any comments or questions for me, you can leave those down in the comments section below. And lastly, as always, thank you very much to my channel members and patrons. Take care everyone, and I'll see you all again soon.